Let's Give It Away by the Flamin' Groovies, just one of many bands and musicians featured in Michael Goldberg's new book, Addicted to Noise, The Music Writings of Michael Goldberg. In the early days of the World Wide Web, former Rolling Stone senior writer and associate editor Michael Goldberg published an online music magazine. Addicted to Noise, or ATN, was the first online magazine to include audio samples with new album reviews. The list of bands and artists interviewed include Neil Young, R.E.M., Patti Smith, Sonic Youth, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, Tom Waits, Lou Reed, Paul Westerberg, and Prince. Michael conducted many of the interviews, but also enlisted music critics like Dave Marsh, Greil Marcus, Deborah Frost, and NPR's rock and roll historian Ed Ward, one of the founders of South by Southwest. Some guest columns and reviews were written by musicians themselves. Among the contributors were Joey Ramone, Lenny Kaye, David Was, and Sleater-Kinney's Corin Tucker. Michael's best interviews, essays, and profiles, not only from Addicted to Noise, but also from Esquire, Rolling Stone, DownBeat, Creem, New Musical Express, and the San Francisco Chronicle, are collected and available in his new book. Stay tuned as Michael joins me today on Frets. You're listening to Frets with DJ Faye. No lessons, no technique info. I just talk to people who play guitar. Stay tuned. Well, Michael, how's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for having me back on your podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back. Well, before we get into the new book, I want to mention to the listeners that Michael and I talked earlier this year about his previous book, Wicked Game, the true story of guitarist James Calvin Wilsey, a book I enjoyed so much. And it was interesting that after we did that episode about Jimmy, I heard from a lot of people I knew from high school who weren't even aware that Jimmy had died. And some of the ones who did know weren't aware that there was this great book. And I'm so glad that it got some recognition for Jimmy. And it was just, as tragic as his story was, it was a fascinating look at his life and his talent.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I wrote the book, and in part anyway, was because, Jimmy died and no one knew he died. And there was, initially there was no coverage at all about it. Until I did a piece for Rolling Stone, there was no, meaningful obituary or anything. And, I had just felt like that was so wrong. And that kind of got me started working on the book, that book. So I'm really glad that the word was able to get out, and a lot of people who knew Jimmy, at least they could know what happened,
right?
And that he had passed away sadly, but that's something that people want to know about an old friend, or
Yeah, it was great to read that. Well, we've talked before about your very early middle school years in San Francisco area, taking photos of rock stars, creating rock posters and photographs, and interviewing some very big names like Jerry Garcia. And all of this was well before the internet and the World Wide Web even existed. And by the time online information was available, you had already interviewed, many rock icons. You'd been a journalist contributing to Esquire and Creem and New Musical Express, and had become senior writer at Rolling Stone. The point being that you'd already been writing for printed publications for years, and now there was this new medium, the internet, and you latched onto that very early and had the idea to create this online music magazine. Tell me a little bit about how you actually got Addicted to Noise off the ground.
Yeah, well, I was an experienced journalist, many, many years of interviewing everyone from, John Fogerty and Neil Young to, doing some cover stories on Michael Jackson. And I had just interviewed many, many musicians by the time I started Addicted to Noise. And basically what happened was this. Now you got to go back to like 1993, and there's basically the World Wide Web has just kind of gotten going. But most people, I mean, 99% of everybody in the world knows nothing about it. What they did know about at that point, what I knew about, was America Online, and
AOL.
and there was some music stuff going on America Online. And I got this idea. I thought, well, it'd be pretty cool if you could do a music magazine on America Online, because there was people from all over the world using America Online. And so if you put up a story or a column or a review there as part of this, magazine I had in mind, then you could have readers from all over the world coming in and checking stuff out. I mean, it just seemed like it'd be a cool thing. Well, I put together this whole idea, and I spent about a year pitching it. And there was a big corporation that seemingly was interested. And I mean, they wasted a year of my time. And finally, when the year was up, I said, all right, I'm just starting this thing. And with like $5,000 of savings, in my bank account, out of a room of my house, I started Addicted to Noise. And I started it on the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web was way better than America Online, because you could combine on the same quote unquote page, you could have text, but you could also have audio.
Right.
And so, yeah. So you could have an album review, and you could have sound samples from different songs. And so, I mean, for the first time ever, a reader, of a review of an album that isn't even out yet, or is just about to come out, or has just been released, can hear the music, some of the music, while they're actually reading the review.
Man.
Or reading the feature story. And that was just a completely radical new thing. And the thing was, I just did it. I had all these relationships that I had established over the years with, publicists and sometimes, record company presidents, and it was all these people in the business that I knew. And so I basically took the position that this was really good for the record company, for the artist, that people being able to listen to a sample of the music, they were going to be more apt to buy the album if it was a good album than if they couldn't hear the music.
Yeah.
And so I took that position, and so I just went ahead and we just started doing it. And from the first issue, which went live December 1st of 1994, we had sound samples. And at that point in time, this was all so new. I mean, most people did not have internet access. If they did, they had it via a dial-up through their phone, and most people couldn't listen to these sound samples because it would just take.
Oh, right.
The files were so big. But we just went ahead and did it, and so by the time people did have the bandwidth, we had this whole archive of stuff going on. So anyway, that's kind of how it got started. And I mean, it was great. From really, like, within the month, there were people coming to Addicted to Noise from all over the world. I mean, we like literally see, all the different countries and how many people were coming from each country. And it was just like my dream come true. It's like, because here you could do something on, let's say, a cult band like the Flamin' Groovies, and their fans who are spread out all over the world could all come to this one place and read this story and listen to a review of their new album. And so it was like aggregating the fans in one place. And so groups that normally felt like they, well, God, there's 3 people in this place and 2 people when we come here, and no one, we do a show and the place is half empty. Well, in this online world, it was a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And it was really, really good for them.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, these days, of course, we've become very accustomed to all these things. But man, in the 90s, that just had to have been such an exciting thing for, the ability to include audio alone just opened up the experience, for people to access this and not just, read on a printed page this review, but to be able to hear clips. That's just so great.
Yeah, and it's really hard for someone like right now, let's say, who's like 20 or 25, to realize. I mean, this was like, if you can just imagine, there was no such thing as TV, or there was no such thing as the movies, and suddenly there's TV.
Yeah.
Suddenly there are movies. And I mean, it was it was just as radical as that. And because now it's just the most ordinary thing, and everybody has their cell phone, and everybody can stream music from YouTube or Spotify or multiple other places, and practically every song that's ever been recorded is online. I mean, it's a completely different world than it was back then, from a perspective of a music lover, and from the perspective of someone who loves movies.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a completely different world now.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Looking to buy a guitar, an amp, pedals? Find great deals on all of these, as well as audio and recording gear at reverb.com. You can also sell your gear through Reverb. They have great articles about music gear and bands. And Reverb believes music makes the world a better place. That's why they created Reverb Gives, that provides youth music education programs all over the world with the instruments they need to make music. Link to Reverb through Frets with DJ Faye in the show notes for this episode. Well, I mentioned that you had already been writing for quite a while, years before this all happened. But going back again to when you were starting out, like when you were really young, you, like a lot of us in those days, the 70s, were reading a lot of music magazines, Crawdaddy, Creem, Rolling Stone. I think many of us, at least back then, regarded Rolling Stone as sort of, it was the big one. That was the big music magazine. And from what I know of you, there was this love for the music that drove you to want to write about it and meet these people so you could get their story. I love that you were bold enough as a young teen to approach Jerry Garcia and ask him if you could interview him. I mean, you were just a kid. And he said yes. Next thing you know, you and your friends were schlepping a big reel-to-reel tape machine over to his house to record Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty wild. I mean, I just had the guts, or
it was very brave. It was pretty brave.
I don't know what it was, but when my friend and I had parked on the road that was going up Mount Tamalpais. There's a road, road that goes, you can just winding road that goes up, and we had a friend who was the son of Tom Donahue. Tom Donahue was a major person in the music industry, and he had a record company, Autumn Records, that had recorded the Beau Brummels. Sly Stone had been a producer there, produced hit records for the Beau Brummels. He had been a DJ on Top 40 radio, but he had started the first underground FM radio station in the world, wow. KMPX. And that was, so this is a major guy, right? And so his son was in one of our classes, and we had become friends with him. And so now we're going up to visit our friend and park the car, and we start walking up, and I see standing at the top of Tom Donahue's driveway is Jerry Garcia. And that was the kind of thing, he would have people like Jerry. They would be visiting Tom Donahue. I mean, he was a major guy, Of course, Jerry Garcia or someone like him would be hanging out at Tom Donahue's place. But I don't know. I saw him, and it was just, I went right up to him and told him we were starting this, me and my friends were starting this, going to do this print rock magazine. We're 17 years old at the time, and asked him if he would do an interview. He could be the cover. And he was like, sure. And he gave us his address and, where he lived in Larkspur. And so we showed up the next, whenever it was that he wanted us to be there, we showed up. It was like in the early evening, and we got there and knocked on the door, and his girlfriend, who was called Mountain Girl, she answered the door, and looked at us like, what are you guys doing here? Because what are these 17-year-old kids doing here? And I've got this tape recorder. I mean, this was not a cassette tape recorder. This is like a 3-foot by 2-foot or whatever, reel-to-reel tape recorder, because that's what you needed, what you had in those days if you had anything. And so, I'm like, well, Jerry Garcia told us to come tonight so we could interview him for this magazine we're starting. And she's like, well, that's funny, because he's supposed to leave to go play the Keystone Berkeley. Well. and anyway, she went back and he says, oh, he comes in, he's like, he remembers, and so he invites us in. And we quickly set up in his living room, and we did this interview with him. And it did end up being the cover of the one issue of a rock magazine called Hard Road.
That's right.
That was named after an album by John Mayall, and which we thought was a suitable name, because we thought for musicians it was a hard road.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why we settled on that name. Anyway, he was the cover.
That's great. Well, over the years, when you're interviewing lots and lots of people, I guess it's inevitable that you'll experience an uncomfortable conversation with someone who's either not crazy about being interviewed, or maybe even in some cases they have like this disdain or distrust for journalists. I'm thinking in particular about, in the book, the first session you did in a San Francisco hotel room with Frank Zappa. He got a little pissy.
Well, this was 1975. And this was one of the first interviews that I'd done. I mean, I had, I did some interviews back when I was 17, and I had, had done some things for the high school paper. And then when I was in college, I did a few interviews for an underground paper called Sundays, but probably I had done, maybe 8 interviews or something like that prior to this interview with Frank Zappa. And so I was a huge Frank Zappa fan, I'd been listening to the Mothers of Invention since their first album, Freak Out. Yeah. And so I loved Frank Zappa. And so my wife and I, she was my girlfriend at the time, we went to interview Frank Zappa, and the door opens. Someone let us in. I don't know who it was, but someone let us in, or he called out, come in or something. And anyway, we go in to this dark hotel room at the Miyaku Hotel in San Francisco, which is just up the block from Winterland, which is where he was going to be playing. And sitting at the far end of this couch it was just like this darkness. I mean, he was like this bitter dark, he's drinking coffee, and, I think I can't remember now if he was smoking or not. I mean, he probably was. Yeah, he was. He smoked. And so he's sitting there. We come in, and right off the bat, it's like, no. And now we have, this is 1975. Now there are small tape recorders. So we're not lugging a reel to reel.
Right.
And so, I get out with the tape recorder to set it up, and he says, no, you can't record this. And I'm like, we can't record it. I mean, we want to do this as a Q&A interview. I'm sorry, you can't record it. You have to take notes or whatever. I don't care, but we're not going to record it. So right off the bat, I'm like thrown way off balance, because suddenly I'm just imagining, God, I've got to take down everything he says. And it's not like I know shorthand or anything like that, And so anyway, yeah, we start asking him questions. And I mean, I should have known, because Frank Zappa, if you read anything about Frank Zappa, he was just a very sarcastic, cynical guy, but I was naive. This was early, like I say, I'm in my early 20s. And anyway, so at a certain point, he's like, I don't know, he's saying, something just ridiculous. And I say, well, God, I'm like your biggest fan. And he's like, says something like, well, if you're my biggest fan, I'm in big trouble. So, it was like, but we just persisted, and we just moved ahead, and asked him all the questions. And the thing is that an interview like that can be really interesting to read later.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think that interview is interesting to read.
It is, yes.
And it, you know, even though it's very difficult for the journalist who's being, kind of to some extent abused, the tension between, the journalist and the person you're interviewing can really add to the interview.
Oh, yeah.
And you can sometimes just get really, really great stuff, but it's not ideal.
Right.
And it's not, I mean, that it's not the way to really get some, if that dynamic, you're not really going to get someone opening up in the way they can if they trust you,
Sure.
trust that, this is a person I can really say what's on my mind, because they're not going to, sort of use it to hang me.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a lesson in journalism. At a relatively early state.
You also included a second interview with Frank that was further down the road at his Laurel Canyon home, and in that I read that, and he seemed a little less uptight during that second talk.
Yeah, it was totally different. I mean, and the thing was, this was like 5-6 years later. I think this was 1980, I believe. I have to look, but and the thing was, it was completely different. And he was accommodating, and he really, I probably spent at least 2 hours there with him and interviewing him. And I decided to include that interview as well because I really thought there was a lot in that interview that he said that was worthwhile.
Yeah, it was great.
That somebody who cared about Frank Zappa would really get something out from. And I was a story I was proud of, and I like the fact of the contrasting interviews. I thought that was also kind of cool.
Yeah, I'm a huge Zappa fan too, and I enjoyed both of those chapters. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Small man wears big shoes. Don't make him grow, just feels a little bit higher. But he's now.
After playing with bands in garages and basements, Jimmy Griffin's group Broken Toys became a huge hit in the Midwest. Jimmy became a much sought-after player with a variety of tribute acts: Street Fighting Band, Celebration Day, El Monstero, and The Hard Promises.
I played with them a couple of years ago, and we were going through some of the songs, and Adam turned to me and he was like, "Man, this is real." And I was like, "Dude, your band made me I learned how to do that stuff via that band, and that was a really huge thing for me to play with those guys. It was fun."
Hope you'll give my talk with Jimmy Griffin a listen on Frets. Another interview in the book that I found fascinating was your talk with another person I'm a huge, huge fan of, and that's Tom Waits. I couldn't tell, and he was, at the time, I forget the time period on that one, but I know he was a lot younger when you interviewed him, and I couldn't tell if he was just messing with you or if he was just in a bizarre mood. I mean, he's an interesting person, but it was bottom line, it was a very fascinating read your talk with Tom Waits.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was, I think 1977. And, so relatively, I mean, Tom Waits had 4 albums out at that point. It was pretty early in his career.
Yeah,
and,
right.
And the thing was, I mean, I went in there with some questions. I mean, that were, we're kind of challenging Tom Waits. I mean, because here's this guy, I mean, really, I think a middle-class guy, and he's adopted this whole sort of I'm hanging out with the bums sort of look. And he's like, oftentimes he'd be wearing his sport coat and pants would look like he'd been sleeping in them, and his shoes were all, scruffy, and, and he had this bit of a, goatee going on. And I mean, it was a whole image, it was, I mean, the headline of a story that ran in the Berkeley Barb that my wife and I wrote was The Bard of Skid Row. And that was, that was kind of the persona that he was putting out in terms of him, who he was. And then, he was writing about all this stuff kind of like that at the time. And it kind of went in there. Well, like, what's the deal with this? That was kind of, what's the deal with this? Why are you, how come you're always wearing, you're wearing, I read in these articles, your tie is stained and your shoes are like a mess. And so really, I kind of put him on the defensive, and then he, in turn, acted. I think kind of acted appropriately in a certain sense. But I mean, I think it's like a hilarious interview, and yeah, he's like, I mean, there's just some stuff in that interview that I think people who and actually people can read it online because the online magazine Pop Matters ran that interview. I mean, I gave it to them to to put online. They put it up, recently, because I wanted people to be able to get a little bit of the flavor of some of the stuff that was in the book. And so, yeah, I think people get a real kick out of it if they search for Tom Waits, Michael Goldberg, Pop Matters. Yeah, they'll have fun.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier that some of the interviews and essays in the book date back to before your time with Rolling Stone. And once you were there, though, once you were actually working at Rolling Stone, had to be a great feeling being part of this magazine that you really dug when you were just starting out. I mean, I know I've read that you really looked up to. You read the magazine, and I know you were a big fan. So then here you are working there. That just had to be this great feeling.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I spent 9 years with the goal of getting hired by Rolling Stone.
That was your mission.
I mean, it really was. And I studied articles in Rolling Stone. I studied, how they were constructed, and, because basically there was Rolling Stone had an approach, and, and a lot of magazines do. And so I felt I needed to understand that, and I needed to be able to learn how to write a story that was appropriate for Rolling Stone, but then also be able to do it one better. And so really, I every time I would write a story for anywhere, I was thinking, well, this is just pretend that you're writing a story for Rolling Stone.
Wow, that's great.
But one of the things that I think really helped me in terms of getting hired was a lot of people, when they did a story about a rock musician, they would interview the musician, and that was the end of it. They would then write their story based on this interview with a musician. And what I would do when I was doing a feature story or a profile, I would be a reporter, and if I could talk to one of their parents, if I could talk to or a brother, or if I could talk to I would talk to their manager, I would talk to their producer. I mean, I would report.
Yeah.
Talk to and so. So I ended up doing stories, and there's a bunch of stories in this book are examples of that. But I mean, there's one on George Clinton. That's a really good example. It was a relatively early story that I did for Rolling Stone. And then that story, I mean, there's a lot of sources that I used for that story. And so, I got hired because they wanted a reporter who was doing that kind of work.
Yeah.
And so that got me on board, and it was it was great. I mean, at the point when I was hired, which was at the end of 1983, I mean, there was nothing I wanted kind of more in the world, than to be working. And at that point, Rolling Stone was still, the print magazine was it. I mean, yeah, there was Crawdaddy and there was Musician and there were other publications. Creem was still around, but that was like Rolling Stone was sort of the center in terms of music journalism at that point in time. And so, yeah, it was great. It was a great thing for me.
Yeah. The first issues of Rolling Stone I read were my older brother's, and they were still the old folded newsprint, like a newspaper. It's so wild.
Well,
I don't know if he still has some of those. I wish I did. I've got a bunch of my old, back when it became more of a glossy, slick magazine. But when we were kids, when living with mom and dad, my brother had the newsprint versions.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first issue got published in 1967, and me and a friend of mine used to go to Sausalito every week because there were all these, every week the Avalon Ballroom and the Winterland and the Fillmore, they had these great posters that were being designed by people like Moscaso and
Rick Griffin,
Rick Griffin and Wes Wilson, and so anyway, the poster guy, we called them the poster guys, would come around and they would go to all the different shops in Sausalito and try to get them to put the posters in the windows. And so we would go there and we would go right after them and ask the owner of the shop, hey, can we put our name on the back of this poster? And then next week, when the new poster comes up, let us have it. And they would say, sure. And they would also be putting these handbills in all the stores. And so we'd grab a pile of handbills. Sometimes if we actually ran into the poster guy, he would give us each a poster. And so we were there every week. And so one week we're there and we go into Tide's bookstore in Sausalito, and there's the first issue of Rolling Stone. And we stood in the store and read that thing cover to cover.
Wow.
And then pretty quick I subscribed to it, and, but yeah, it was, I mean, that was really the first time that there was kind of a serious journalistic approach, adult approach being taken to rock music.
Yeah.
Before that, there was 16 magazine and that kind of thing, but it was not, it was nothing like what the early issues of Rolling Stone were.
Yeah, I mentioned Rick Griffin. It reminded me that I'm pretty certain he did the lettering, the original masthead.
Absolutely.
The Rolling Stone lettering. Yeah. So.
Yeah. No, he did.
Yeah.
And that was something we knew that. I mean, as me and my friends, it was like, yeah, hey, look at that. They got Rick Griffin to do the logo.
Yeah,
I mean,
cool.
It was,
If you have a question or comment for Frets, call it in. A link to my SpeakPipe is in the show notes and on the Frets Facebook page. It's easy. Just click the link, record your message, and hit send. Your voice could be heard on Frets.
Hey, this is Michael Goldberg, and you're listening to Frets with DJ Faye.
I would think that a pretty good chunk of my listeners are familiar with Greil Marcus. I know when I was younger and reading Creem and Rolling Stone, he was a pretty regular music critic and columnist, and even in recent years I've seen and read pieces that Greil wrote for Pitchfork. Greil wrote the foreword that appears in your new book, and he talks about your genuine curiosity about the people you interview and your ability to ask great questions that often get them talking about things that maybe hadn't been discussed previously with other people who interviewed them. I like how he sums it up in the foreword and says this. All through the pages, you can hear the people Michael Goldberg is talking to and about reach the same conclusion. I can trust this guy, they say. What the hell? And when I read that, I interpret his saying what the hell as these people were like, well, why not? Why not open up to him? Because I think I think what he's trying to get across is people felt comfortable with you, talking to you about things.
Yeah. No, that's definitely, I think, it was his intention. And the thing is, there's interviews in this book, I think a prime example is the interview I did with the women in Sleater-Kinney.
Yeah.
And it's a very long, extensive, in-depth interview. And the thing is, they knew kind of going in that I was a huge fan of their music. But when we sat down and started talking, they could just tell by my questions that, this was a person who really was very interested
you were
in
a fan.
What they thought. Well, not just that I was a fan, but I was really interested in their music and in getting them to talk about the music and kind of where it came from and what they were trying to express in it and that kind of stuff. And that I wasn't some kind of celebrity, reporter who's looking to get dirt on them or, that kind of stuff. And so they, to have somebody who, because they had some bad experiences. I think Time Magazine had done a piece, it was either Time or Newsweek, I can't remember now, but I think it was Time, that they really found offensive. And it just focused on them as people and their relationships and that kind of thing. And they really, boy, did that rub them the wrong way. And so to have me there and talking to them about music was, and so subsequently, they really opened up to me, and it's a really interesting interview because of that. And kind of the same thing to an extent with the interview that Jan Uhelski and I did with Patti Smith, which is also a really in-depth interview. And there's a lot of great stuff in that. And, and there's interviews in this book, I talked to Lou Reed, I talked to Neil Young. And yeah, I just think that, I think what Greil says is very true.
Yeah, it was really nice.
And I was really, really pleased that he was willing to write a foreword to my book because, in my opinion, he's really sort of the greatest rock critic. I know a lot of people, I've said this before, but a lot of people, say, oh, well, Lester Bangs is the greatest rock critic. But Lester Bangs was he was a really good rock critic, and he did some really, his approach was very unusual and quite brilliant. But Lester Bangs wasn't around very long. The period of time that he did rock criticism was pretty short, and then he was dead, sadly. And Greil Marcus has been writing for decades since then and written so many books. And his latest book, which is called Folk Music and is about Bob Dylan, is absolutely brilliant. And so to have him to write a foreword for my book was just very, I'm just thrilled about that.
That's great. Well, after almost 10 years of working at Rolling Stone, you moved on to other things, and including the launch of Addicted to Noise online. Do you feel like being away from Rolling Stone then opened up some opportunity to interview or write about people that maybe Rolling Stone either might not have been interested in publishing stories about, or just that, I don't know, or different projects that you wanted to do, but maybe you didn't feel like you could do that at Rolling Stone?
Well, it was what really was different was, when I was at Rolling Stone, I was working for editors there. When I started Addicted to Noise, suddenly it was like, well, I'm in charge of this.
You were in control.
This is my thing. I can do whatever I want, and that was a feeling I can't even describe.
Wow.
Of what that was like. And it wasn't so much that, I could interview people I couldn't interview at Rolling Stone, although that was definitely the case. But it was really about that this was my baby.
Yeah.
And it was, everything about it. From, I developed a relationship with Frank Kozik, and then he did the logo for Addicted to Noise. He was like, one of the great poster artists of the 90s. And so to have him doing my logo, and other work, other artwork for the original Addicted to Noise online, just everything from that to who was writing columns for the magazine and who, which writers I had involved and the stories that we were doing and the interviews we were doing. I mean, it was an amazing thing for me. And, I did that for the next, 6 or so years of my life. And, it was, working for Rolling Stone was incredibly intense. And I did that for nearly 10 years. And then Addicted to Noise, doing that for the next, 6 or so years was even more intense. And it was just it was just an incredible experience that I had.
Yeah. Well, this is the 90s, and, when ATN was happening, and I think you referred to it earlier, but I'm pretty sure you did, but we were talking about Music News of the World. That was picked up not only by MTV as a source of music news, but many radio stations worldwide, and even some print publications like Melody Maker and New Musical Express. They were tapping into Music News of the World. Yeah,
I mean, it was something that we hadn't, I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't thought that was going to happen. I mean, I just thought, well, we're going to do this news section, and calling it Music News of the World was like a joke. It was sort of like a play on all the tabloids.
Yeah, kind of tongue in cheek. Yeah.
Yeah. But really quickly that caught on, and that became the most popular part of Addicted to Noise. Wow. And, it was, and to be able to be breaking music news worldwide over and over again was really exciting.
If you're a podcast addict like me, you might have thought about starting your own. I'm having a lot of fun creating and sharing my podcast, Frets with DJ Faye. It seemed daunting at first, and I had no idea how to proceed after recording my first episodes. Then I discovered Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout has helped over 100,000 people, even knuckleheads like me, launch a podcast. The tools they provide make it incredibly easy to get your thing going. They'll also help you get your podcast into all the major podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and more. You get a great-looking website, audio players to drop into other websites, analytics, and tools to promote your podcast. To get a no-risk free trial of Buzzsprout, or to find out about their low-cost monthly plan options, follow the link in today's show notes and let them know that DJ Faye sent you. Learn the ins and outs of podcasting through people who eat, drink, and breathe it. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, back to mine. Well, Addicted to Noise, the book version, spans over 40 years of your writing about bands and artists. So a lot of really great and fascinating stuff. When I do read a book, 99% of the time, it's obviously start at the beginning, make my way through chapter by chapter. I have a confession. After reading the really nice foreword by Greil Marcus, and I looked over the contents pages, I found myself reading your book almost like reading a music magazine. I knew I'd read it all eventually, but I saw the list, all the chapters about all these people that I really love. So I found myself I jumped to the Neil Young chapter, the Zappa chapter, the Tom Waits. A huge fan of Richard Thompson. I loved that. The Richard Thompson chapter I really love because I've been a huge fan of him for so long, but it was really interesting to me that he was so modest talking to you. It felt like things like, you mentioned comparisons to Robbie Robertson, and he found that very flattering and complimentary, as opposed to someone might someone might disagree and say, oh, I don't think I sound like that person, or I don't know, maybe someone would even be insulted by a comparison to somebody. But anyway, and this doesn't really surprise me, but he seems just like a charming person. And it was really, really nice to read that chapter. He would sometimes even kind of downplay his own talent on guitar. I think he even used the words, I don't think I'm a good guitar player at times, which kind of blew my mind. Something like that. Anyway, I've seen him quite a bit in concert, and he's also like very funny. His banter between songs is just great. But that, many of the chapters in the book are just so great to read. But that one was one in particular that I just really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, I mean, I spent some time with him. That was for Creem magazine, and I was a big fan of his. And he had just put out, him and Linda Thompson. Yeah, they had just put out Shoot Out the Lights.
Such a great album.
And, I mean, it's just like a completely brilliant album. And sadly, I mean, it was an album, it was about the end of his marriage.
Yeah, they were basically writing and performing songs about their marriage dissolving, but it's just such a brilliant and beautiful album.
But here they are, they're touring, and their marriage has fallen apart at this point. And they're in, separate rooms and, maybe even separate hotels. And, but every night they're getting up on the stage and they're performing this material. I mean, it's a really kind of an amazing thing that was happening. But, and it was really cool because when I spent the time with him, he had just seen, or was just actually going to see, this Bob Dylan, movie that had not been released. That had been, there had been, Don't Look Back had been made and had been released. And then when he went back to Europe and toured with the group that would become the band, but which were the Hawks at that point,
right.
backing him. They shot a movie that was supposed to be for TV, for ABC, I believe, but it was so eclectic and unusual. It wasn't something that could have gone on TV. And so it was to this day, it's never been officially released. But there was a copy that was sort of circulating, and so that very day he was having the opportunity to see that, and and so Dylan came up in our conversation and all, and he was a huge fan of Dylan.
Yeah, I've read that.
Yeah.
Now that I've admitted to skipping around the book, I'll mention just a few other chapters that I really loved reading. Of course, both of the Zappa interviews. I loved the Tom Waits interview. I've been a huge Neil Young fan as long as I can remember, and that chapter was so great. I could tell you also feel this incredible connection to Neil Young's music and just how cool he is. It was kind of fun too to read that Kurt Loder of MTV was kind of around for that. I always liked Kurt Loder. It seemed pretty cool.
When I first started working for Rolling Stone, doing stuff for Rolling Stone, Kurt and I co-covered and co-wrote, I think it was a cover story about, there was this benefit tour that was going on, and I think Jimmy Page and some other just amazing guitar players were performing for this thing, and so Kurt and I ended up hanging out a lot and co-reporting this big story, and so we were friends, kind of journalistic friends. But quite a bit of time had gone by, and then so when I showed up for this to basically, Neil Young was doing a certain number of interviews, not a lot of interviews, but he was doing them, and the place he was doing them was at this kind of mountain restaurant, and that was like, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes probably from where he was living on the West Coast, where he had his ranch. And so, Kurt Loder was there. It was great to see him. And he had, I guess, already done his interview with Neil, and then I did mine. And this was when the album Mirrorball that he had done with Pearl Jam backing him up was just coming out. And it was exciting I had interviewed Neil once before for Rolling Stone, but that was just by luck. I mean, basically his manager, Elliot Roberts, who has passed away but was alive at the time, basically Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young had reunited. This was after David Crosby had gotten cleaned up. He had become, he had real problems with drugs,
right.
but he had cleaned up. And once he was cleaned up, Neil was willing to, rejoin Crosby, Stills, and Nash for a tour and to make an album. But so I went down to Santa Barbara, flew down to cover that, and Elliot Roberts wouldn't let me talk to Neil Young. I got to talk a little bit to a few of the guys, but he was just like, no, who knows why. But I did the best I could, to pull together stuff that I was going to write a story when I got back to the Bay Area. And I get on the plane and I take my seat. And right before the plane is going to take off, Neil Young gets on and
Wow.
and he takes a seat like 2 rows in front of me. And he's sitting in this row by himself. Well, once the plane is in the air, once the seatbelt sign goes off, I get up, walk up 2 rows, and sit down right next to him and say, Neil, Michael Goldberg from Rolling Stone, I hope you don't mind. Could I talk to you a little bit? I'm doing a story, and I love it. And he was like, yeah, okay. And so I got to interview Neil Young for 45 minutes
That's
while we
great.
flew up to San Francisco. So I'd interviewed him before, but this was the first time it was in advance set up. Okay, you're going to interview Rolling Stone, and they were doing this because Howie Klein at Reprise Records, where Neil Young recorded, where he did his albums, he had really, pushed for Neil to talk to me because, like I'd said earlier, he understood what a reach Addicted to Noise had. And so I got to sit down and talk to Neil, about the album, and what I really got into with him, and what I think is the reason I put that interview into the book, was he really talked quite a bit about songwriting and how he wrote his songs and how they came to him. And so I just thought that was really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I was real. It was great. It was great to be able to talk to him.
I loved when Neil was explaining the title Mirror Ball. Just fantastic. I'm not going to share that right here. I want the listeners to get this book and read all about Neil Young talking about Mirror Ball.
Yeah. Well, I hope they will get the book because I'm really proud of the pieces that I included in this book. I got to say,
It's really great. There are great chapters on Patti Smith, Devo, Captain Beefheart, Brian Wilson, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones. The list goes on and on. I think we could, and I'd love to talk for hours about the book and all the fantastic content in it. Did a really great job with it. So, Michael, I want to thank you again for sharing this compilation with fans of great music, and a very big thanks for coming back on the show to talk about it.
Cool. Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm really glad that you had me back, and I've really enjoyed talking to you about some of the things that have to do with my journalism career and about this book and all that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.
Cool.
All
righty.
See you, man.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Frets with DJ Faye. If you like the show, you can follow or subscribe for free at most podcast platforms. Hope you'll join me again next time. Stay tuned.